just for the benefit of the recording, I just want to make you aware of the fact that the workshop doesn't necessarily reflect the views of Upskilling Lancashire or UCLan, and all the facts are believed to be correct at the time of the recording on the 2nd of June today. When we're looking through this session, I just want you to be aware of the fact that I'm kind of looking at this from two angles. I'm assuming that we're all employees, even if it's only the fact that we work for ourselves. So we still have a responsibility for ourselves, but also many of us have probably got responsibility for those who work for or with us too. So I just want to make sure that I'm coming at it from both angles. So if you're an employer at the moment, it's a challenging time, I dare say. So we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So without further ado, let's just get into the details a bit. So what specifically is it that we're going to be looking at today? So firstly, I think it's worth saying that I think, and please feel free to call me a pessimist if you like, but for many of us, I feel that we are about to enter a truly unprecedented, and that's a word that's been thrown around a lot, but period for us at work. There is likely to be pressure of a different nature or possibly greater than we've experienced before. And unless we do something positive to prevent it being the case, it's likely that that increase in pressure will lead an increase in stress and anxiety for us all. So we need to do something to try and prevent that being a major problem for us. And the good news is there are things that we can do, and we'll cover some of those off as we go through the session. So I want to just be clear about the fact that we're talking about resilience, but that isn't just a buzzword. There's more to it than that. And hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate the fact that there's some really sound theory. I want to have a look at the fact that when we say I'm stressed, there might be slightly more in terms of nuance to that than we might think at first. And it's important that we're able to differentiate how we're feeling and what's made us feel that way in order to find a way to be able to cope with it effectively. And yeah, you know, squeezy balls are all well and good, and those sort of initiatives that I'm sure we've all seen at work from time to time. And I don't mean for 1 minute to demean any of the really good work that happens, particularly around the area of wellness and well-being and mindfulness, because I think it's all really useful for us. But some of those things have been covered off in the previous session. So I don't know if any of you joined the sessions with Michael Quigley and Mick Stott that preceded this one, but they've looked at some of those things. So I'm going to come at this from a slightly different angle, so to give a broader picture for those of you who have joined those sessions. So I hope that makes sense. And before I go into the detail, I just want to make you aware of the fact that, you know, I'm not just making this up. This isn't going to be a session that labours any background theory and research and psychology, but I just wanted to make you aware of the fact that, you know, I really aren't making this up. There's something in this, some background. And these are some of the key figures here that I just want to share with you. First of all, Mark Brackett, who's the director of the Yale Centre for Emotional Intelligence. I strongly believe that developing our emotional intelligence massively helps us in terms of our resilience, both by making us more aware of our own emotions and enabling us to manage the emotions and the relationships with other people more effectively. I am going to make reference to some work from Professor Sir Cary Cooper and his colleague Ivan Robertson. Their organisation, Robertson Cooper, have something called Good Day at Work. If you haven't encountered this, I would strongly advise you to have a look at the Robertson Cooper website. And I'm going to ask you some questions in a moment about the iResilience questionnaire that you've been sent a link to, just to see if any of you have had an opportunity to do so yet. We'll come on to that in a moment. And then Ian Price is a performance psychologist, and he is here due to the book that you can see an image of there, Head Start. Really good book if you're interested in just some practical things that you can do to improve your level of resilience. There's no commission on my part. It runs to about 150 pages. Particularly good, he's a bit of a tennis fan, so it's particularly good if you're going to be missing Wimbledon, some really good tennis analogies that he uses for the message. And then finally, there's me. So you may well be asking, what do I bring to the party? Well, as you can see from the badge at the bottom of my picture, I'm a mental health accredited instructor trainer. That's one string to my bow as a business, but I've got 25 years of experience in management and leadership roles in both the public and private sector. And in that time, I have seen the good, the bad, and to be honest, the downright ugly of leadership and management. And so what I'm all about is looking at the ways in which we can all support our own well-being and those of people who work with us and for us, but also just looking to see if there's anything in terms of the existing management and leadership practices that might be exacerbating some of the mental health concerns that people have. So what I'm doing today very much forms part of that overall picture. And the good news is that you're probably very zoomed out. So first of all, I'm going to get you involved by asking you to contribute to chat and to the poll, as I said. But also, I'm going to give you a break. So we're going to go for about 30 minutes, and then I'm going to give you an opportunity to go away, grab a brew, stretch your legs for 5 minutes. And I will be starting again strictly on the 5 minutes. But I'm going to give you one question to think about while you're away, and then we'll come back and share chat. So the first part of the session is about setting some background and getting probably a greater understanding of ourselves in terms of how our overall resilience fits in with the current situation. And then the second half of the session is going to be getting down into a bit more of the detail about things that you can practically do and to reconsider some of the ways that you focus on particular potential stressors to change things and make things better for you and easier to cope with going forward. I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that stress and anxiety and fearfulness are all very valid emotions to feel at the moment, as they always are, but it's the inevitability that we need to challenge. We shouldn't go into this assuming that the world is going to be harder. For sure, it's going to be different, I suspect for the longer term, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's harder for us. So the bit I wanted to call out for all of us to share now is the fact that they identify through a good day at work that our resilience has 4 elements to it, as shown on the screen here. So the first one is our levels of confidence. So if you feel more confident about a given situation that you're in, you are likely to feel more resilient. Social support is important. And this very much comes back to the mental health and the mental health first aid of having somebody to talk to. Just speaking and listening non-judgmentally, having somebody that you can go to when you've had a bad day that will show you a degree of empathy and be able to give you that support. Adaptability is going to be one that is really key for us all at the moment, clearly. So the more able and willing we are to be able to make change, the more resilient we're likely to be and the less stress reactive we may be. And the other one is purposefulness. Now, I know this has been a particular issue for people who have been furloughed, because it was okay initially, and it was quite good, I dare say, for a lot of people not to have to attend work and still get paid. But if you had a job that really kept you on your toes and was a significant part of your life, that sense of purposefulness has been hard to get to grips with. And there's been a lot of research over the years that has shown that as well as being overwork and overload being stressful, so is under-resourcefulness. So if you don't feel you're being useful and there's purpose to what you're doing, that itself can be problematic for us. And they identify that those 4 things help to build our overall picture of resilience. And a key element of that, which I think we need to be aware of, and is really good news in the context of learning in this session, is that resilience is a combination of your personal characteristics and skills. And the good thing about skills, of course, is that we can develop them. So as we start to talk through some of the potential options that you have here, please bear in mind that they might not be easy initially, but with time you will start to develop them. Apologies if you can hear my dog in the background. My wife and I are both involved in things at the moment, so he's left to his own devices. And the other thing to bear in mind is that our resilience levels are not constant. And just to give you an example of that, I talked about confidence being one of the 4 contributing factors to this. You might find yourself in a very familiar environment where you feel that you've got lots to rely on in your back pocket, which is going to help you to manage and to cope. Find yourself in a different environment and it might not be the same. You might find that some of those things that you relied on for a comfort blanket, for support, to give you that level of resilience are no longer there. So it does shift a bit. So I think it's useful for us to bear that in mind. So one of the things that Roberts and Cooper have done particularly well during this period is to talk about the likely stages, the probable stages that we're working through on our COVID-19 journey. I think it's important to remember that we've all got different experiences here. Some people's have been broadly pleasurable, some people's have been really traumatic, and we've all seen and probably, unfortunately, know examples of both. So we should not assume that people's experience has been the same as ours to start with, but also there are some key elements that we can probably focus on that might help us to understand where people are. Now, anyone who's familiar with the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross change/grief curve will probably see a little bit of familiarity in this. But what Roberts and Cooper have done is broken it down into 4 specific areas. So at the beginning, so we're going back to probably mid-March, I guess here, acute uncertainty was the characteristic of that period of time. So there was a tendency for us to analyse and probably overanalyse and try and absorb as much news as we can, and to catastrophise and think that this was going to be really severe. It's not been a great picture, but everything seemed to suggest that the world would stop. And of course, we know now that that hasn't happened. It's changed, but there probably hasn't been a stop, or there hasn't been. And they identified that we have at each one of these stages some mental health priorities. And in this case, they said we needed to think about maintaining energy, so keeping ourselves going basically. And that's when you probably heard people talking about trying to maintain some sort of routine, and to assess the new environment. So things have changed, but often anxiety particularly is driven by not knowing what's happening next. So to get a clearer view of what the situation really looked like would have been helpful for us. Stage 2 was disruption. So this is when we started to feel angry and fearful and sad about the situation we find ourselves in, thinking about the things that we're going to be missing, the colleagues that we're not seeing, the birthdays that we'll miss, the vulnerable people who are being isolated and who we can't go and see. They identified, and the first one, of course, here was extremely difficult for most of us. The priorities that we needed to focus on to look after our mental well-being at this point were social connection. We all know what a challenge that's been, but thankfully, we're doing this now, not 30 years ago, and we have got social media to rely on. Reevaluating your purpose. They saw this as being really important at this stage. And then thinking about developing some resilience techniques that we may not have focused on before. And there's been loads of stuff shared on social media about this, I'm sure you've seen, that we can chip into to help us to start to probably be a little bit more aware of what we can do to help ourselves, and then to find something that fits our particular liking. Then they move on to the 3rd stage, which is the adaptation. So this is when we start to explore, see what the world really looks like and see what we can do differently and what's changed. And then to experiment a bit and try a few things out. And then to get to the stage where we're actually starting to understand both what the world looks like now, what's happening around us in a bit more detail, probably drawing some of our own conclusions rather than simply being led by what we see in the media. And then starting to continue that resilience journey. And the important thing at this stage is that we can start to think about having conversations and starting to collaborate with people where we can help one another through to the next stage. And that final stage in this process is the new normal. And this is about adaptation and acceptance. So we need to get to the stage where the world has changed and we can't expect it to change to fit us. There has to be an element of us changing the way that we work and behave so that what we do fits in with the new world. That doesn't mean that we should just go along as passengers and not try to influence it in any way, but there's little benefit to be gained from knocking against it all the time. We need to have some level of acceptance there. And the priorities at this stage are I couldn't avoid the stay alert, apologies, but we need to be alert to our well-being as we go forward. Not only do we need to look at it in the situation that we find ourselves in now, but also develop some really positive habits that we can draw upon when things become tough in the future. And then to carry on with that conversation and the level of collaboration that we've got, to make sure that we don't assume that the first answer we come to is the best answer, but to continue to look for ways to resolve things and keep talking to one another, keep the conversations and the communications open. So the next thing I want to look at, and this very much goes back to Mark Brackett, the director of emotional intelligence at Yale, and he very much believes from an emotional intelligence perspective that we're far better able to manage our emotions and our responses to things if we're able to accurately describe them. So if you can name it, you can tame it. And I just wanted to share that what we call stress actually is often more nuanced than that. So let me just give you the 4 areas that they highlight as being part of the what you might call the stress picture. So the first one is anxiety. So often when we talk about stress, we think, oh, I'm feeling stressed. Probably if we dig a little bit deeper, it's anxiety that we're feeling anxious. And their simple definition of anxiety is that we worry about the future uncertainty and our ability to control what will happen to us. So I can't imagine there's anybody over the last couple of months who hasn't felt a sense of anxiety. And I think we're probably starting to see, as we start to move from phase 3 to phase 4 in most cases, and think about what the world of work is going to look like going forward, that level of anxiety is going to increase. So that's something that we definitely need to have a look at. Fear is another element that we often put in the, if you like, the stress bucket. And this is the palpable sense of a danger that lies just ahead and will eventually hit us. So whereas anxiety is worry about the uncertainty, fear has more of a real sense of something is going to happen, it's going to be damaging to me. Pressure is probably common and familiar to many of us. So it's a force from the outside that tells us something important is at stake, and whether we succeed or fail will depend on how we perform. So if you like to think about it in terms of any task that you have, something that you're given to do both in your, either in your personal or professional life, that's hard and difficult and you can't quite work your head around it, and you're worried that your reaction to that challenge and that task might not be up to par, and therefore you feel a sense of responsibility for making that happen and the potential impact that it might have on you and others. So that's probably something that we're all familiar with. And then finally, they do come to stress, which effectively is the combination of any one or more of those 3 things that we've just looked at that come together and mean that effectively the demands that we feel upon ourselves are greater than the emotional resources that we feel we have to cope with it. And as I said at the beginning, I think that an element of stress is both inevitable and it's in some cases quite helpful in terms of keeping us on our toes and being, some people will say that they're very motivated by it. But when it becomes chronic and difficult to manage and starts to impact on your day-to-day performance, then clearly it isn't. It's gone a stage too far. Of those 4 areas, if you think about what generally the emotion that you would call stress, what tends to trigger it for you? Do you think it's actually anxiety? Is it that you're frightened about things? Do you just feel an enormous sense of pressure? Or is it just that there's so much to cope with and you don't feel that you have the resources to deal with it? So I just wanted to think before we go on, and this is more about me banging a drum about not just looking at our individual responsibilities, but thinking about how this works as an organization or a group in its loosest sense, if you like. The people in the middle here are the people who are in the know, and those people have a level of influence over the people above them. So this is your leadership or management team. Probably got a clearer picture about what the future is likely to look like for the business as it stands at the moment, because that's where we are. We've been involved in those decisions. But what I wanted to pull out here is that we need to understand and appreciate the fact that the impact of our own feelings of stress and anxiety have an effect, a ripple effect, and it can be a positive or a negative effect on the people who work around us. And the people who are in the dark grey colour here, they're those who will kind of broadly take it in their stride. They might have a little bit of anxiety that they share, but it won't be unduly influenced by the stress that we exude, if you like, the feeling of stress and the potentially difficult emotions to deal with. The people who are in the green are largely oblivious to it. They've just got a level of resilience where they can focus on their own job, crack on and not worry about what's going on around them. But then you get the odd people in the amber and the red who are more likely to have a negative reaction to this. And I just wanted to point out the fact that we need to be aware, we need to be honest with people, we need to communicate clearly, so that people know as much as they possibly can do about a situation. But just to be aware of the fact there will be some people who may find it more difficult to cope with these circumstances than the majority for various reasons, and to not assume, and this is very easy to do, and I'm guilty of this myself, that you have got far more pressure, far more to worry about than those around you have. In fact, everyone's got a different perspective on this, and their needs change and differ and will fluctuate over time. So a couple of key questions just to ask yourself really. If you're feeling stressed or anxious, who's affected? You know, these could be people you have personal relationships with, these could be people at work. So just have a think about that and think about, is there any way in which you might be able to limit that? And then also, when my laptop builds up, who can have a positive impact on how you feel? So if there are any people around who you think, I know that you're particularly useful for me, and the relationships that we have and the contact and the conversations that we have are particularly good for me at the moment, try and build on those relationships and make the most out of them if you can. So I just want to introduce now what we're going to be looking at in the second half of the session. Those who were on the previous session with me will be familiar with these. I like to consider that the pressure that we're under, and let's call it stress for now for ease, can be put into three boxes, three categories. So everything potentially that causes us stress can be placed in one or the other of these. So the top one, the bottom one rather, is the, so what? You know, at any given moment in time, something seems to be a real issue and we worry about it and we let it push our emotional triggers. But if we were to look at it with the benefit of hindsight, tomorrow, in a week's time, we'll probably say, yeah, that really wasn't such an issue. Why did I let that get to me so much? So that so what box is a place for us to stick all these things that we don't really need to worry about. They're causing us, they're taking our attention, they're using some of our emotional energy, and we've got nothing to be gained by doing so. The next one is the, stuff happens box. Life throws things at us, and regardless of how much planning and organization we do, sometimes things just happen that we can't influence. And if we spend too long worrying, being concerned about that and letting that get to us and be a cause of anxiety, then we are not helping ourselves, and there's probably very little benefit to be had from that. And then everything else basically in our lives ends up in that top box to deal with it. So I think it's probably interesting just to give you an idea of how my journey started, because I didn't mention this at the beginning. On Friday the 13th of March, I delivered a coping with stress for team sessions to an intensive care team at a hospital in Hackney in London. They had just on the Thursday evening admitted their first COVID-19 patient. So I'm sure I'll never deliver a more timely session in my career. But that gave me a view of what was going to be the immediate future, what it was likely to be. And then walking around London afterwards and catching the train back up, I realized how challenging the whole situation was going to be. And that colored my judgment, I think, probably unduly, because I started to overthink things and worry about things I truly had no impact over. And I found myself in stage one for far too long as a result. But hopefully the people I trained were able to come out the other side a little bit sooner. Okay, so let's have a look at what we can do to unpack some of these boxes. I think it's useful to us to give it a bit more of a view. So, Susan Cain here. If you don't know her, she does some good work looking at the different behavior types and how it tends to be those who speak loudest who get heard most rather than the introverts amongst us. But she's quite right. If we focus on, and that came up in the chat comments from a few of you, the more we focus on stuff that we can't control, it has a disproportionate impact on how we feel. So there's no benefit in doing so. So in that box, if we looked at it in a bit more detail, our so what box, the question that we're asking really is, something seems to be a big issue for me at the moment. It's kind of taken over my focus. It's causing me to be in a bit of a mood and to slam drawers and to be a bit mardy. If I think, how will this look and feel with hindsight? And I think, actually, it's of no real consequence. I can't do anything about it. Pop it in that box, seal it up, don't worry about it again. We can't afford, we've got too much to think about and to worry about, to expend energy on those. It's always worth saying, so can we avoid this completely? Is it a situation that can be completely avoided? So let me have a think about, we might be worrying about and feeling slightly anxious about what's going to happen on that first time we get all the family together, once we're out of the other side of this, because I know that, for instance, my father-in-law has a particularly problematic, from my perspective, attitude about this situation. And I know if I end up sitting next to him, we'll argue. So can I avoid that? Yeah, I can. I can just make sure that I don't sit at the same end of the table as him and avoid that conversation in the short term. It might be that type of avoidance, so not dealing with issues that need to be dealt with, but avoiding dealing with issues that you can avoid, might be helpful. Stick it in the so what box and move on. This is the area where all those catastrophic thoughts lurk, all the I'm always rubbish at this, I can't do this, things never work out for me. Not true, absolutely not. Stick it in the box, tape it up and forget about it and move on. And if you find yourself thinking, actually it feels really reckless to stick these things in here, how can I ignore things? I really encourage you to think again and think, actually, is there any benefit in me mulling this over for any longer? If not, in the box, off it goes. So that's our so what. Hopefully that makes sense and you can see where that can be beneficial to you. The next element of this is that, in life, stuff happens. So what can we do to deal with that box and to make sure we've got it as full as we possibly can do? There's one key question that we always need to think about first. Could we as a team have done anything to influence that event? Because if the answer to that is yes, then it doesn't belong in this box. It needs to go into the next box so that we can make sure that we avoid anything happening of a similar nature in the future or reduce the likelihood of it. But if it's just one of those things that life throws at us and it's completely beyond our control, there is no benefit at all for us in expending any energy on that. We just have to accept that life's not perfect for anybody, despite their Instagram feeds, and just move on. It's easier to say than do sometimes. And we need to challenge that negativity bias, challenge the fact that everything seems to be wrong, everything's bad, nothing's working properly, everything's working against your best interests. That will not be the case. We just have this incredible bias for focusing on what went wrong rather than focusing on what went well. And if we can challenge that, put those negative things in that box and think about, okay, so what can I do better? What can I do to influence things in the future? Then we deal with the things, or rather isolate the things that we can't deal with and just focus on the things that we can. And then finally, you need to be decisive about this. If you decide that actually, I'll just put that down to one of the things that life's thrown at me, you need to seal that box up and don't be tempted to go back in and start rummaging around in it again. Because it's that rummaging when we start to think and ruminate about stuff that doesn't do us any harm, doesn't do us any help rather, when we're trying to move on and focus on the things that can help us. So I hope that all makes sense. So we've got a whole host of things in there that we don't need to worry about, but we tend to. So if we can stick them in there, that means that we can spend our time focusing on where we can really add value. And that is our box where, and my mum will be very glad to know that she's quoted on here. She said this to me a lot. I obviously have always been a terrible procrastinator. I know I am now, and it must have been the same when I was younger. And my deal with it box is full of things that I could have done, but for one reason or another, I found an excuse or a reason not to. And my biggest cause of anxiety and stress and pressure, and in some cases fear, is that I know I could have done something about that, but I haven't done so. And the more I get to grips with that, the healthier I become. So if you're in that same camp with me, you need to really pay attention to this box. So anything that's in here should be anything that's left over, and if it matters or it adds value, it's something that's part of your core beliefs or something that you know is going to be helpful for you and the people around you, It's in this box and you need to deal with it, or you need to find a way in which it can be dealt with. Really important, therefore, that you don't just rush into this. Don't sit on it forever. Don't procrastinate too much, but think about what you're going to do and what you're going to say in order to deal with this and deal with it once and for all. Try and get things dealt with firmly and wholly so that they don't end up trickling back down. And then, now this is a really important one, I think, and if we can bear this in mind going forward into whatever the new world and the new state looks like, I think this will be massively beneficial for all of us. Good enough will do. If we have a task, we have a client need, we have a learner need if we're in education, we need to address that. We need to think about, what does that person need? What does the organization need? What do my people around me need? And aim to address that and do it so that we do it well, so it's good enough. Don't try and go beyond that, because if we do, there's very little reward for that, but there's a hell of a lot of stress and pressure that we put on ourselves as a result of it. So a key thing, I think, going forward is just to consider that. And then this box also has some other elements that we need to bear with. It's kind of a subdivided box, really. And in amongst those dividers, we've got some options. So when you're starting to look at how you're going to structure your business and how you're going to work going forward, I think it's really worth asking yourself these 3 Ds. Can this task be delegated? Am I the best person to deal with this? Could it be beneficial for somebody else too? Is there somebody else who's far better skilled to do this for me? You could do it more efficiently, in which case, why not delegate it? Can it be done differently? So are there things that you do that are very time consuming that could be done in some way, be automated, for instance? We might not be talking about complex artificial intelligence solutions, but just being able to run a macro in a spreadsheet or do a little bit of coding that might make a difference, or just rather than doing a manual mailing list, just spending a little bit of money on getting something where you can manage that through a system. And then the other thing that I think we're going to have to ask ourselves, is there anything we can apply desist to? Can we stop? Is there anything that we used to do that didn't really add any value or is no longer relevant? In which case, let's just stop doing it. And then it won't appear in any of our boxes again because it's no longer an issue. So delegate, do something differently, and desist. Stop doing it can all be really helpful for us. Now, hopefully that makes sense, and you can see where some of the things that you're currently focusing on, or you tend to focus on, might be able to be managed a bit more smartly, if you like, by categorizing them. Now, this is familiar to people who were with me last time. In the title here, I'm talking about active recovery and bounce back ability. Bounce back ability is something that Ian Price talks about in his book. He likes to see that, you know, we all drop, things do fall to the ground, but it's our ability to have the resilience to bounce up that makes a difference. And the surface that we bounce on, so the familiarity that we've got with it, will determine how high that bounce back is. I use something that I call the meter to explain how we can influence our state of health and positive well-being, and to some extent our ability to cope with stressful situations. And this meter says that if we start the day broadly in the green, so we're on the right hand side of this chart, we're not in a bad place, so that when something happens that's stressful, the meter will go down, but we're still able to cope. I'm not right down in the red because I've built myself a bit of a comfort blanket. And the more things that I've got in my boxes that are marked so what, or, you know, stuff happens, the more likely I am to stop myself getting dragged down to the left. And the more I do in terms of looking after my overall well-being, the more likely I am to find myself back in the green. So positives take us into the green, the full tank where we've got energy and we're able to cope. And the higher we are there, the more able we are to cope with things when they get really bad. So if we'd been down in the red when this impact had happened, we would have been in serious difficulty. So it's worth bearing in mind that it's a movable feast, this. Our level of well-being and our resilience is not constant, but we can do things both to positively reinforce it and to avoid things becoming a problem for us. I think it's just quite a useful visual. So, finally, just before we round off, I've got a couple of questions that I just want to point out to you. Again, I shared these in the last session, and I share them in pretty much everything that I do when we're talking about organizational well-being. we're going to be looking at things. We're going to be making some difficult decisions. And if we want to make sure that we put our people at the center of our organizations, and including ourselves, and that we're all in the best place to be able to cope with what's thrown at us, these two questions will serve us well. So just ask yourself, is what I'm doing helping me or harming me? And if the answer is helping, carry on. If it's harming, think, in that case, is there something that I can do differently to make this less harmful? And perhaps more importantly, as organizations and as leaders of organizations, is what we're doing helping or harming those around us? So there will be a solution to a problem. There will be a solution to this enormous hole we can see in our cash flow. But is there something that we can do to resolve that avoids putting undue pressure on the people around us, and therefore means that probably people will be in work, be more effective. We won't see and there's clearly a risk in this, an increase in absence when we come out of this. But they're only any good, those questions, if we're willing to do something about it, and we're ready to do something about it, and we're able to act, so we feel empowered enough to do so. But other than that, they can be key things. Hopefully that makes sense for you. As I say, you'll be getting these in a handout, so you'll have them to refer back to. So just by way of a recap, what are the key things that we've looked at? First of all, it's important to understand that resilience involves skills that we can develop. So rest assured, if you work on this, you will be able to find yourself in a better place. Remember, if you can name it, you can tame it. So if you call it stress, but actually it's just that you're anxious about what comes next, think about what you can do to ease that anxiety a bit, because the different elements will have slightly different solutions. Think about those three boxes. Can it go in the so what? Can you just say, well, you know, stuff happens, or do you need to take a positive decision and deal with it in some way? And finally, always ask those questions. Is what we're doing helping or harming us as individuals? And is what we're doing helping and harming those people around us? So I hope that the stuff we've covered off this morning has had some value to you. Just by way of a closing statement, if you want to contact either Matt Skidmore at Upskilling Lancashire or myself, our contact details are here. And also, just wanted to make you aware of the fact that there's one final session in this series, which is on Thursday, coming out of lockdown, a practical HR guide for anybody who's interested in that. And finally, both from a UCLan and an Upskilling Lancashire and for my own benefit, we'll really value your feedback on these sessions. These are going to be, or something of this nature is going to be, a feature of life, at least for the foreseeable future. So I, for one, would like to get them to be as useful and as beneficial to you as we possibly can. So anything you can give us in terms of feedback will be really useful. So thanks very much for your time this morning. Really appreciate it. I hope this has been of some use to you. Thanks for joining us.